the last few episodes, we were talking about the establishment of British control in northern India. We had a discussion of how the East India Company began to control the entire region politically. New administrative structures were created, and the commerce of the region passed into their hands. Around the same time, similar processes were at work at Dakhin or the Deccan. 18th century Deccan was a scene of frequent military conflicts. You have the Marathas, you have the territories controlled by the Mughal viceroy at Hyderabad, the Nizamul Mulk. In this constellation of regional powers in the Deccan, Mysore emerged as perhaps the greatest threat to the company, partly because of the ability on the part of the rulers of Mysore to increase the military power of the state. But military power alone was not the foundation of their strength. They also developed the economic resources, which is why some scholars often describe the state of Mysore in the 18th century, created by Hyder Ali, and the tradition continued by Tipu, as an enlightened despotism.
So why is it called enlightened despotism?
They describe it as enlightened despotism, and the comparison with Europe may not be so relevant or may not be so useful, but there are yardsticks of comparison, because as some of the improving enlightened rulers of Europe tried to develop their own states economically, the rulers of Mysore did exactly the same. Apart from centralizing the administration, which was certainly an administrative necessity or administrative compulsion, they made provisions for loans to the peasants. Peasants who didn't have enough resources were given loans in the form of cattle, in the form of seeds, in order to carry on cultivation. And the objective was to create agricultural resources. Revenue system was streamlined with the objective of getting as much as one could from territorial revenue. But in order that the peasant could be able to pay this revenue, there were attempts at the same time by these rulers, by Tipu and Hyder, to offer them loans in order that they could actually improve on cultivation. So there was an attempt, certainly, to increase the economic resources of the land in order to make it militarily more powerful. They were interested in commerce. Malabar was occupied and there were political military reasons for it, but Malabar was also important for trading purposes. His ships laden with Indian luxuries and spices would sail to Constantinople. He would send mission to Constantinople, not merely to forge political linkages with the Caliph of Turkey, but also to explore possibilities of commerce in this region from Mysore. Mangalore was emerging as a very important port in the Konkan coast under the rulers of Mysore. And the occupation of Malabar obviously gave them access to one of the commercially rich areas, one of the great centers of spice trade. Hyder and then his son Tipu, during those 4 decades when the sultans of Mysore were in power, tried to build a powerful state in the region to be able to contain the British. Containing the British also became one of the main objectives. And in order to achieve that objective, Hyder initially, and then this strategy was continued by Tipu as well, tried to create great coalition of Indian powers. But this coalition was not likely to survive.
Sir, why didn't the Indian combination work?
There were a number of reasons for this. In the first place, if you look at the ancestry of Hyder Ali, in the perception of the Nizam, was an unruly upstart, a man who had achieved power by marginalizing the existing Hindu rulers of Mysore, Chikkadevu Vadiyar, taking advantage of the conflict between Vadiyar and his Prime Minister Nanjaraj. So during the Carnatic Wars, Hyder Ali gathered some experience, built an army, forced Nanjaraj out of power, and then, although he gave nominal acknowledgement to Vadiyar's rulership, virtually he became the ruler of Mysore, and this was recognized by the Mughals when Nizam actually gave him the title of Nawab. But it was a recognition of power, but Nizam wouldn't accept him as an equal, as a person with whom this kind of a combination can be struck in order to contain the British. Secondly, and this is in my assessment, maybe the kind of commitment to this kind of a cause also lacked, because all of these powers, the Nizam on the one hand and the Marathas on the other, were interested in their small territorial gains. So occasionally they would side with the rulers of Mysore for a certain cause, and then they would desert them. And this was to happen time and again. There were moments when the Marathas were friendly or the Nizam was unfriendly, when both were friendly, but there would be moments when both were unfriendly and were willing to desert Tipu Sultan by striking alliances with the British, which they did a number of times. And thirdly, if you talk about the Marathas, as you know, the Maratha state itself was in doldrums, because the control of Pune, whereas you know the Peshwa had taken over power from the house of Shivaji earlier, about which we will talk about later, was losing control over these great Maratha generals who had set up their own independent centers of power. The Holkars were stationed in Indore, the southern part of Malwa, Mughal province of Malwa. The Sindhyas were more interested in the north. For some time, Sindhya was controlling Delhi, and he was ultimately entrenched in Gwalior. The Gaikwad had moved to Baroda in the Gujarati region. So it was difficult also for the Peshwa to bring all these Maratha leaders together, because even if they would actually, as they did in 1761 when Abdali invaded India, or they organized an army and went up to Panipat to fight him, but it was difficult to keep this combination together. I think these should be the structural explanations for the failure ultimately on the part of either Hyder Ali or Tipu Sultan to keep the coalition that he wished to create together. So this is a situation where they had to depend on the French.
Sir, how far the French could be relied upon?
That's an interesting question. I mean, if you look at the history of Mysore's relations with the English and the French playing their part as a support, it becomes clear that they were not very consistent. I mean, they certainly pledged support. They gave Hyder a certain assurance and particularly during the Second Mysore War. When Hyder was campaigning in the Carnatic, a small contingent of French forces came, but they didn't wish to take part in the war unless Hyder had made a lump sum handsome payment. So Hyder refused to pay, and the French were standing there. Were not in a mood to fight the war. In the midst of the war, when the war was continuing in December 1782, Hyder died. You know that there were a number of phases. There are 4 wars. First war was in the late 1760s, when Hyder had some success in the Carnatic, but ultimately a kind of peace was restored. I am talking about the Second War, which was more elaborate and which was more extensive, which continued for some time. It started around 1780 and then continued till 1784, when his son Tipu Sultan signed that famous Treaty of Mangalore. So both Hyder at the time of his death and Tipu Sultan, when he became his successor, expected that French would give them enough support. Support good enough for them to contain the British. This never happened. So Bussy, who was to come from France and join the French forces in southern India in order to rally behind Tipu, proved to be extremely untrustworthy or proved to be extremely fickle. He came, he had no concrete plan to work out his strategies against the British. He was needlessly waiting and going to the extent of suggesting secret negotiations with the Marathas and Nizam, the two adversaries, or the two friends who turned adversaries, by defecting the Great Coalition and siding with the British. So I would imagine that the French were not so trustworthy in the way Tipu or Hyder expected them to be. The kind of straightforwardness that you come across in Tipu's dealings with his enemies or with the British even was not visible in the French conduct with them. And this was not very unusual, because this was a period, or this was the time when treachery was the order of the day, and the kind of straightforwardness that Tipu Sultan was expecting from the French or from the others was never reciprocated. So the French option was a necessity, but whether in the long run or whether in Tipu's or Hyder's attempts to create a powerful anti-English coalition, the French had been able to play the expected role, is a matter to be debated. I don't think that the support that the French gave was adequate. Even though Hyder and later Tipu continued to value the French friendship, they were sending embassies to France, or after the revolution, Tipu went to the extent of planting a liberty tree at Seringamapatnam. And in fact, as you know, that this was also Tipu's undoing, because when the British realized that there is always this possibility of a powerful Indian state forging intimate links with a power capable of containing the British or fighting the British in the continent of Europe or here. And the Napoleon was in 1798 emerging as a major threat in Europe on behalf of the Revolutionary Army. And there was also a change in India, because by then Cornwallis had left, or John Shore had also left. Wellesley had taken over, and Wellesley's imperialism demanded a certain kind of forward policy, or inspired him to take a forward policy here. And so when Tipu was actually showing signs of opening negotiations with the French, forging close relationship with the French, the British took alarm. So, in a sense, that was also the source of his undoing as far as Tipu's relationship with the British was concerned. But what is important is that Hyder and Tipu together had taken a position against the inexorable British advance. Even though there were speculations that Hyder, towards the last part of his life, when he was dying in the midst of war, was actually thinking of establishing peace with the English. But I have my own doubts.
Sir, if Hyder was so pessimistic about the outcome, then why did Tipu continue with his struggle against the English?
That is the question. I mean, one British officer, Mark Wilkes, actually wrote about Tipu confiding to his Prime Minister, Pandit Purnaya, the famous man who served Hyder and then also served Tipu. And this also is a corrective to the general impression that Hyder and Tipu's regime was a communal regime. I mean, they might have proselytized, they might have followed some measure of proselytization in Malabar for some time. But if you look at Mysore, they had Hindu officials who were great support to them. According to Wilkes' version, that Hyder in 1782, before his death, when he saw that the great coalition had dissolved and Nizam and the Marathas were not willing to give Hyder the kind of support that they had promised against the British, apparently Hyder actually confided to Purnaya that the British were unstoppable and therefore it would be wise for his son to come to an agreement with the British. Now, there is another account, a Kannada account called Hydarnama, in which there is a description of the War Council meeting, in which Hyder was spelling out the future plans of action. Emphasizing how it was important not merely to revive the idea of coalition, the kind of great coalition that Hyder had in his mind, but also to forge more intimate links with rulers of Iran, Afghanistan, and France, to cultivate international support in order to vanquish or in order to fight an enemy which was so exceedingly powerful, in order to fight the British. So, the argument or the idea that Hyder was turning into a defeatist in 1782 at the moment of his death is not really acceptable. And this is the reason why you find that Tipu was continuing with his war against the British even after his death till 1784. The Mangalore was under British control for some time. Mangalore was besieged by Tipu's forces, and that would have been a very decisive war. In the Battle of Cuddalore, towards the close of 1793, Bussy had the opportunity to inflict a major defeat on the English forces, which he didn't complete, which is the reason why it remained an indecisive kind of a military engagement, compelling Tipu Sultan to come to an agreement with the British in the Treaty of Mangalore in 1784. Even if he signed the Treaty of Mangalore, he was not willing to be cowed down so totally, because the next year he issues an embargo against British commerce at Malabar. So that is also one reason why Malabar spice trade was an important consideration for the British. In the Third War, when Cornwall is able to outwit Tipu Sultan, create that combination again of Nizam and the Marathas, defeated Tipu Sultan in the war and finally signed the Treaty of Seringapatam, the immediate step after the Treaty of Seringapatam, in which Tipu had to give away Malabar to the British, was an elaborate administrative paraphernalia that began to be followed in Malabar itself. I mean, they were trying to impose direct control over Malabar. So this is very significant, because Malabar was always an important center of spice trade. The English was looking at Malabar very lustingly from Bombay, and Tipu was also trying to deprive them of easy access to the spice sources. The French are operating from Mahe, which is very close to Kozhikode or Calicut, as it was called. So given this kind of a situation, the kind of policy that Cornwallis adopts after the Third War, after the Treaty of Seringapatam, in which Tipu signed, accepted defeat and gave away Malabar, you see the intention very clearly. On the one hand, you have a Nawab who was not willing to be completely outclassed militarily, or to accept so willingly British suzerainty or British dominance. You have, on the other hand, British trading interest in the region, which were actually trying to establish control over Malabar in order to keep down the prices of spices at a reasonable level. You have small Rajas on the coast who were constantly actually negotiating with the British, as the Travancore did, and in fact intervention in Travancore in 1790 was the occasion when the Third Anglo-Mysore War started. So I don't think that this argument of Hyder's defeatism is acceptable. On the contrary, we can see how the spirit of animosity continues, how attempts were again made by Tipu to create that combination, although it failed because of other reasons, because of the reasons of which I have already explained. But finally you come to that final war in 1799. When, as you know, the British imperialism acquires a new character, new thrust, Wellesley adopts new expansionist strategies, and ultimately he had to die fighting on the outskirts of Seringapatam, and that was the end of a major resistance undertaken by one of the most promising 18th century states, but it had a long-term impact. Once the Mysore state was finished, it was the turn of the Marathas, because the Marathas in any case were so divided that it was very difficult for them to create or to continue with their war, or to sustain that combination against the British. And it is important, or you can see how between, say, 1800 and 1818, in 2 decades, the Marathas gave way. The British managed to knock them down one by one. And finally, the complete control of over Deccan was established by 1818. A new empire was being born, but to that story we'll turn later. So as we try to wind up this part of the discussion, you see a few very important points. In the first place, Mysore was an example of a brilliant state for building. I mean, it was an example of how there was a certain vision of modernity evident in some of its policies. Combining military power, trying to set up a navy, and combining all this with a certain commitment to create a prosperous state, to increase economic resources of the land, going to the extent of establishing some kind of a state trading corporation, which was a government body, a state body interested in business. Second, this powerful state naturally emerged as the most important threat in the region. Even though the Marathas were there and they were going to they remain there for another couple of decades, but they were unable to create this kind of a combination, or they were unable to create this kind of power which Mysore was able to galvanize in its attempt to resist the British. And thirdly, the failure of the coalition. It's a very important question which we are trying to address in almost all these discussions on how the British were able to establish their political control in South Asia. I mean, at times they came together, but most of the time they were drifting apart. It was easy for the British to play on their local territorial ambitions to pit one against the other. Given this, the Hyder's vision and the same strategy that was continued by Tipu to create this coalition, I think was a great event, was a very important vision that one must recognize, despite the fact that it didn't succeed. I mean, there are many failures in history, but this is one such failure in which you can see a grand vision emerging from Tipu's or Hyder's mind to create a coalition against the British. You can call it proto-nationalist. It's not nationalism, but it was anticipating some kind of a national coalition against the enemy, the Firangi, the foreigner.